Los Angeles International Airport, or LAX, was a bustling scene filled with noise and activity, a place where countless stories unfolded amid the constant rush. Business travelers hurried past families, flight attendants clicked across the shiny floors, and weary tourists clutched their luggage, searching for a moment of respite before their flights. Among the chaos, Charles and Margaret Robinson stood patiently at Gate 47B, awaiting the boarding call. Charles, at 78, held himself with a proud posture that belied his age. His salt-and-pepper beard was neatly trimmed, and his brown skin bore the gentle lines of a life rich with experience. Margaret, 74, exuded grace. Her short silver curls framed her face, which had witnessed decades of change, yet still glowed with warmth. Their attire was elegant but subtle. They didn't need flashy clothes to make an impression. They carried an air of quiet dignity. However, their presence was noticed. When Charles approached the gate agent, a young white woman with a tight, blonde ponytail, she barely looked up as he handed her their boarding passes. In a monotone voice that suggested disinterest, she informed them that coach boarding was not yet underway. Charles glanced at the boarding pass in her hand, then back at her. "We're in business class," he stated, his voice deep and steady. She paused, seemingly trying to absorb this new information. Her gaze traveled from his suit to Margaret's. Pearl earrings and something in her demeanor shifted, though she quickly recovered. "Oh," she muttered, scanning their tickets. "I just assumed—" "Never mind. Go ahead." Margaret sighed softly as they moved toward the jet bridge. "It never changes," she said quietly. Charles gently squeezed her hand. "Let it go," he replied. For now, she did. Inside the airplane, the sound of the engines hummed in harmony with the chatter of passengers settling into their seats. The business-class cabin was only half full, with several suited executives already indulging in champagne. After stowing their carry-ons in the overhead compartment and taking their seats, they encountered him for the first time, Bradley Cooper. Tall and broad-shouldered, he carried the polished bravado of someone who perceived himself as untouchable. His crisp uniform fit him impeccably, his golden hair slicked back, and when he smiled, it was thin and lacking sincerity. As he passed their row for the first time, he didn't spare them a glance. Instead, he attended to the passengers in the front rows, ensuring their drinks were topped off, nodding with warmth at a white cup across the aisle. However, when his gaze finally landed on Charles and Margaret, his smile faltered. "Can I help?" "You?" he asked, though it felt more like a challenge than a question. Charles folded his hands in his lap, remaining calm. "A glass of water, please," he requested. Bradley's eyebrows twitched, and his lips pressed together as he processed the response. "Water service hasn't started yet," he finally replied. Charles nodded, not bothered. "That's fine. Whenever you get the chance." Bradley didn't reply. Instead, he turned and walked away. Margaret adjusted her shawl and sighed. "Here we go," she muttered. Time dragged on. Bradley appeared twice more, serving drinks to other passengers, yet he completely ignored their row. Frustrated, Margaret leaned over the aisle, catching his eye. "Excuse me?" He paused, hands clasped behind his back. "Yes?" "The sea water?" she prompted. Bradley inhaled sharply, clearly irritated. "Sir, ma'am, business class doesn't receive complimentary beverages until the full service begins. If you'd like, you can purchase bottled water when the cart comes through." Margaret blinked in disbelief. "Purchase?" Bradley forced a tight smile. "Yes, ma'am." Charles, unflappable as ever, tilted his head. "We're in business class." "I understand that," Bradley replied, his tone clipped. "But free drinks are for first-class passengers. We have to maintain consistency with company policy." There was a pause, tension hanging in the air. Margaret studied his face, searching for any spark of shame or doubt. There was none. "Sir," Charles said carefully, "I've flown with First Air many times. I'm quite certain business class includes complimentary beverages." Bradley's professional mask slipped slightly, His eyes narrowed and his mouth tightened. "Well, that's not what I was trained on." Across the aisle, a middle-aged man in a navy suit looked up, glancing between Charles, Margaret, and Bradley, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Margaret leaned back, exhaling through her nose. She recognized this type. Men like Bradley always had rules that worked in their favor. "Never mind," she said softly. But Charles, steady as ever, did not back down. "You don't want to serve us, do you?" Bradley's jaw tightened. "I treat all passengers equally, sir." Margaret let out a low chuckle, void of humor. Bradley's hand clenched at his side, his frustration palpable. For a moment it looked like he might let a thought slip, something unpredictable that would just reinforce what they all suspected. Instead, he composed himself and stepped back. "If you need anything else, please use the call button," he said, his politeness feeling rehearsed, before turning sharply and walking away. The silence that followed felt heavy. The man across the aisle cleared his throat, shifting uneasily before leaning in slightly. "That was something," he murmured, prompting a smile from Margaret, though her eyes remained sharp. It was a flight attendant with dark curly hair. Her name tag read Eva, and she approached with hesitation, casting a quick glance over her shoulder, as if to ensure Bradley was out of earshot. Leaning down, she whispered, "I'm so sorry about that. Would you still like some water?" Margaret offered a kind yet knowing look. "Thank you, dear." Eva quickly departed, returning moments later to set a bottle of water on Charles's tray. Just as she did, Bradley reappeared, and his expression hardened at the sight. Eva met his gaze with a quiet defiance before continuing on her way. Margaret unscrewed the cap, taking a sip and letting the coolness soothe her throat. She leaned toward Charles, her voice soft. "He thought we were nobodies." Charles exhaled deeply. "He's about to find out otherwise." Margaret gave his hand a reassuring pat. Let it play out. Outside, the shimmering lights of Los Angeles faded beneath them as the aircraft ascended higher into the night sky, approaching the inevitable. The hum of the plane filled the cabin, mingling with the occasional clink of glasses and low conversations. Los Angeles was now a distant memory, replaced by the vastness of the dark sky. Margaret sat with her hands neatly tucked in her lap, observing the flight crew's subtle movements. She noticed how Bradley navigated the aisle, effortlessly flashing practiced smiles at selected passengers while neglecting others entirely. Charles stayed composed, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. He had weathered boardroom encounters with men far more powerful than Bradley, people who underestimated him. He understood patience. He embodied restraint. Yet what truly ignited his frustration was that this incident transcended a mere glass of water. It was about dismissal, about how individuals like Bradley believed, without doubt, that certain passengers simply didn't belong. And still, Bradley carried on as if nothing had happened. About an hour into the flight, the dinner service commenced, with Bradley once again at the forefront in business class. His posture was rigid, yet his movements were fluid. This was his territory, after all. As he neared their row, Margaret closed her menu and looked up. "Excuse me?" she said. Bradley barely paused. "Yes. Could you tell me the vegetarian options?" He let out a small sigh, as if her request was a significant inconvenience. "We only have one vegetarian dish. Pasta with seasonal vegetables," he replied. Margaret nodded. "That sounds fine." Instead of jotting it down, Bradley turned to Charles. "And for you, sir?" "The grilled salmon," Charles answered. Bradley gave a curt nod and moved on without another word. 10 minutes later, a different flight attendant, Eva, returned with their trays, smiling as she set them down. "Let me know if you need anything else," she whispered. Margaret glanced at her plate and realized it wasn't pasta. It was chicken, something she hadn't eaten in decades. She looked up just in time to catch Bradley's eye in the aisle, watching her. He had done this deliberately. Margaret pressed her lips together. She wouldn't create a scene, but she wouldn't let it go either. She signaled to Eva, who hastened back. "I'm so sorry, but I asked for the vegetarian dish," Margaret said softly. Eva's brow furrowed. Oh, I remember. That's strange. Let me sort that out for you. Before Eva could take the tray, Bradley appeared beside her. We're out of vegetarian meals, he said smoothly. Margaret met his gaze with determination. Are you? Bradley held her stare, his expression impenetrable. Yes. Margaret's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. That's interesting. Because I saw you serve the same dish to a passenger 2 rows ahead. Bradley didn't flinch. First come, first served, ma'am. Eva paled. She recognized the lie. Charles finally interjected, his voice steady but heavy. Is this how First Air treats its business class passengers? Bradley's expression remained unchanged. I follow company policy, sir. A few nearby passengers were now watching, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. But nobody spoke up. Margaret exhaled slowly and leaned back in her chair. I suppose that's all we need to know, she said quietly. Bradley hesitated, feeling an unease at her tone, but instead of probing further, he simply turned on his heel and walked away. Eva, still standing there, swallowed nervously. I can check with the galley again. Margaret placed a gentle hand on Eva's arm. That's very sweet of you, dear, but it's truly fine. Eva lingered for a moment, her reluctance palpable, before she finally departed. Once Eva was gone, Margaret pushed her untouched tray aside and rested her hands in her lap again. Charles remained quiet, but she noticed his fingers tapping rhythmically against the armrest. Margaret recognized the sign well. He was deep in thought, assessing the situation, completely aware that Bradley hadn't a clue about what was brewing beneath the surface. The atmosphere on the flight was thick with unspoken tension. As Bradley continued to cater to the other passengers with his familiar swagger, he seemed blissfully unaware of the scrutiny he was under. Both Charles and Margaret observed intently, noting how Bradley warmly welcomed some passengers, while others were dismissed with barely concealed disdain. They caught every smirk that flickered across his face as he strutted past their row, self-assured he had put them in their place. They remained watchful, poised for whatever was next. At one point, Charles leaned toward Margaret. Do you recall our first major investor meeting in Chicago? He asked. Margaret let out a soft chuckle. The one where they mistook you for a driver? A smile crossed Charles's face, but it lacked genuine cheer. And once they figured out who I really was, their entire attitude shifted, he added. Margaret sighed, shaking her head. Some people like Bradley never learn. Charles nodded once, fixing his gaze ahead. No, but they can be taught. As the flight approached its final hour, the cabin atmosphere began to change. The crew moved with a purposeful efficiency, preparing for landing. Passengers straightened their seats, powered off devices, and stretched, anticipation palpable. Bradley, still exuding his characteristic arrogance, was oblivious to the growing tension surrounding him. Then a moment arrived. A young flight attendant from first class approached Bradley and whispered something in his ear. Whatever was conveyed caused Bradley to go rigid, his head whipped around, eyes darting toward Charles and Margaret. He was struck with a dawning realization. Panic washed over him. Charles caught the instant Bradley made the connection. He witnessed the exact moment curiosity turned to dismay, as the truth of who he had belittled for the last 5 hours sunk in. Bradley took a hesitant step forward, clearly wrestling with whether to speak. Before he could voice his thoughts, Charles turned to him. Margaret met his gaze too, her face a mask of neutrality. For the first time throughout the flight, uncertainty flickered across Bradley's expression. The balance of power had turned on its head, and he realized it. But now it was too late. Charles remained silent. He simply held Bradley's gaze, a moment they had both anticipated. Then, without uttering a word, he shifted his attention back to the front. Margaret mirrored his movement, both of them resolutely turning away. Bradley stood there for a moment, paralyzed, his breath coming in quick bursts. Then he gradually stepped back, his entire composure unraveling under the weight of realization. This wasn't merely a business-class passenger. This wasn't just an elderly couple. This was Charles Robinson, the founder and CEO of First Air, and Bradley had just sealed his own fate. Outside, the city lights of New York began to materialize below. The descent had commenced. For the plane, for the passengers, and for Bradley Cooper, the descent into New York was smooth. Yet inside the aircraft, Bradley's world was spiraling out of control. His palms were clammy, his heart raced. The effortless confidence he had carried throughout the flight was now a fading echo, because now he understood, now he recognized, who Charles and Margaret Robinson truly were. The hushed whispers among the crew had reached him too late, just when the first-class flight attendant leaned in and murmured, "That's Charles Robinson." It was already too late. Bradley had already played his cards, and he had played them poorly for 5 long hours. He had left the CEO of First Air humiliated. The realization weighed heavily in his stomach. He turned his head slightly, stealing another glance at Charles and Margaret. They weren't swaggering. They weren't furious. They were simply waiting. And that scared him more than anything. The plane thudded gently onto the tarmac at JFK. Around them, passengers stretched and reached for their belongings, the typical post-flight shuffle beginning. Bradley barely moved. His mind was racing. Maybe, just maybe, he could rectify this. Perhaps, if he apologized right now, if he explained himself, he could turn it around. No, there was no way to fix this. He had treated them as if they were inferior, and now he found himself beneath them. But he still had one final opportunity, one last attempt to salvage the situation. As the seatbelt signs flickered off and passengers began to rise, Bradley inhaled deeply and walked straight toward them. His voice was careful, measured, rehearsed. "Mr. Robinson," he started, forcing a polite smile, "I just wanted to say that I hope you had a pleasant flight with us today." Charles slowly raised his gaze to meet Bradley's. Margaret's lips curled, just a bit, as if amused by his sudden change in tone. Charles's response was low, yet it cut like a knife. "Did we?" Bradley's throat tightened. "Sir, if there was an issue with the service, I'd be glad to—" Charles raised a hand. Instantly, Bradley fell silent. Then he rose from his seat. At 78, he exuded authority. There was no need for him to elevate his voice. His mere presence commanded attention. Nearby passengers ceased their chatter. The crew peered from the galley, sensing the shift. The atmosphere in the cabin thickened. Then Charles began. "In all my years," he said, his tone unwavering, "I've encountered men like you, Bradley." Bradley flinched at the mention of his name. "You view the world through a narrow lens," Charles continued. "You assume, you judge. You determine who deserves your attention and who does not." Each word hung in the air. Bradley's facade began to crack. His hands balled into fists at his sides. "I asked for a glass of water," Charles remarked, shaking his head slightly. "And you? You decided I was worth one." A passenger several rows back inhaled sharply. Now people were truly listening. "I observed you, Bradley," Charles went on. "I watched how you navigated this cabin, assessing who merited respect and who did not." Bradley's mouth felt dry. Charles let the silence stretch taut before continuing. "And now," he said, tilting his head, "I intend to return the favor." Bradley blinked, the realization dawning. "Sir, you're fired." The words landed like a punch. The cabin fell dead silent. Bradley's face paled. "Sir, please, Charles remained composed. His voice was steady. "Get off my plane." The finality was undeniable. Bradley stood paralyzed. His mouth moved soundlessly. A prolonged, heavy quiet enveloped them. Finally, Margaret broke the stillness. Her voice flowed like silk. "You're dismissed." Bradley turned crimson. Eyes were on him, passengers and crew alike. He was stripped of his power in that moment. For the first time, Bradley Cooper found himself on the receiving end of dismissal, and there was absolutely nothing he could do about it. The walk down the jet bridge felt like an eternity for Bradley, As he stepped off the plane, his mind was a whirlwind. His career had come to an abrupt end, his reputation lay in tatters, and the hardest truth to confront? He had brought this upon himself. Behind him, Charles and Margaret descended from the aircraft, united and poised. They remained dignified. No outbursts, no drama, just a clear sense of justice. As they entered the terminal, Bradley realized something even more crushing than losing his job. He hadn't just been dismissed. He had become a cautionary tale. The world was about to hear his story. The energy at JFK Terminal was palpable. Passengers were joyfully reuniting. Business travelers were glued to their screens. Flight crews were prepping for their upcoming flights. But within Gate 14, tensions were escalating. News had already circulated among the First Air staff. The CEO had just fired a flight attendant in mid-air. It wasn't long before hushed talks transformed into heated discussions. Soon those discussions exploded into headlines. Within an hour, it permeated the internet. Witnesses were tweeting their accounts. Police read, "Just saw a flight attendant get fired mid-flight by the First Air CEO for blatant discrimination. No way." Flash attached. A fuzzy image captured Charles and Margaret's dignified exit from the plane. It was as if karma was smirking. The guy wouldn't even serve them water. And now look at him, unemployed, #First Air, fired. This is how to combat racism in the workplace. Corporate America. Take notes. In a heartbeat, the world shifted its gaze. Meanwhile, Bradley sat quietly, watching his reality crumble. He slumped in an uncomfortable airport chair by the employee lounge, hunched over. His phone felt dangerously tight in his quaking hands. His inbox was a deluge. Messages, missed calls, emails. He opened one from a friend. "Mobile device with an arrow. Dude, what in the world happened? You're trending." Bradley's breath hitched. Trending? His fingers shook as he opened Twitter. And there it was. #FirstAirBradley. Hundreds dots, thousands of tweets. His name was everywhere. Someone had even shared a photo of his employee ID badge. Someone had unearthed his LinkedIn profile. There was even a Reddit discussion dissecting his entire career. Bradley scrolled through the chaos, his heart racing. Fired. Good riddance. We've got enough of his kind in customer service. Fired. He really tossed away his career over a simple glass of water. Fired. Can you imagine being so openly racist that you get let go on the spot? His stomach churned. This was bigger than just a job. This was public. This would last forever. On the other side of the airport, Charles and Margaret sat in a quiet lounge. Oblivious to the uproar their flight had ignited, Margaret glanced through her phone, absorbing reaction after reaction. A small, amused smile formed on her lips. "Well," she said, "they certainly aren't hesitating." Charles took a sip of his tea. "People love a good story." Margaret looked at him, curious. "And what sort of story do you think this is?" Charles placed his cup down gently. "A lesson." Margaret considered this. "Do you believe he'll learn anything?" Charles leaned back, exhaling. "That's up to him." Margaret nodded, contemplative. "Because that's the reality. Some folks learn, some don't." And Bradley found himself at a crossroads. Meanwhile, at First Air's corporate offices, damage control was in full swing. PR teams scrambled to draft statements, while executives participated in emergency calls. Lawyers debated the consequences. This was no longer just an internal issue. It had become a PR debacle. First Air had two paths: completely sever ties with Bradley, or take responsibility for the culture that allowed this to happen. A senior executive sighed, rubbing his temples as he scanned the trending topics. "This could sink us," he muttered. Across the table, one of the company's diversity and inclusion officers leaned in. "Or," she replied, "it might just save us." All eyes turned to her. She tapped on her tablet, revealing a stream of positive tweets, clapping hands. Respect to First Air for taking immediate action. More companies should be like this. Clapping hands. This is the kind of leadership we need. No tolerance for discrimination. #FirstAir. Clapping hands. I wasn't going to book First Air before, but after this, they just gained a new customer. She surveyed the room, sensing a shift. It wasn't just criticism they were facing. It was a newfound respect. If navigated wisely, this could strengthen First Air. The atmosphere grew serious as a pivotal choice loomed ahead. Bradley felt an overwhelming weight. Alone with his thoughts, he focused on his phone, watching his life unravel in real time. Years spent climbing the corporate ladder had polished his image, ensuring he was always in charge. Yet now he found himself in a void. He had overlooked the signs, disregarded the uneasy glances. He had turned a deaf ear, and now he was the one being pushed aside. For the first time in ages, a strange sensation washed over him. It wasn't anger, nor was it defensiveness. It was shame. Genuine, unsettling shame. He caught sight of his reflection in the dim light of his phone screen. Who was he anymore? What had he turned into? And, most daunting of all, was there a path to redemption? Meanwhile, Charles and Margaret gathered their belongings as their connecting flight was called. Margaret linked her arm through Charles's. "We should go." Charles nodded, but paused to take one last look out the terminal window. He had built an empire from the ground up, witnessing the world transform over the years. Yet today was a clear reminder. There was still much to achieve. His journey was far from over. Margaret squeezed his hand. "What's on your mind?" Charles let out a thoughtful breath. The next step. And together they headed towards their flight, toward their upcoming journey. A week passed. Life carried on, at least for most. For Charles and Margaret Robinson, routine prevailed. Meetings, decisions, and a quiet pride in what they had built. For First Air, the incident marked a pivotal moment. As for Bradley Cooper, his world had come to a standstill. First Air takes action. The statement from First Air arrived 2 days post-incident. First Air is dedicated to maintaining the highest standards of respect, equality, and professionalism. The actions observed on Flight 2027 do not represent our values. Effective immediately, we will roll out a comprehensive training initiative for all employees, ensuring every passenger receives the dignity they deserve. The response was calculated, firm, and straightforward, and it had its desired effect. The pushback against First Air began to ease. Customers recognized the airline's quick actions, leading to a boost in bookings as support for its leadership grew. But the lesson was already ingrained. No training could ever undo what had transpired. Bradley Cooper had become the cautionary tale, the example. He was the man who thought he could dismiss others, only to find himself dismissed in return. This was Bradley's new reality, one where job offers evaporated. No opportunities emerged from other airlines, high-end hotels, or any corner of the hospitality industry. His reputation had soured. Initially, he attempted to defend himself, arguing that people had misconstrued the events. He called it miscommunication. But the world was not interested in justifications. One by one, his former colleagues began to disengage, even those who had once chuckled at his jokes, who shared his mindset but remained out of trouble. None wanted to risk being his next chapter. For the first time, Bradley felt powerless. This sinking, unbearable sensation of insignificance was entirely new to him. Men like him never envisioned themselves as fallible. Yet he had stumbled, and no one was there to catch him. Meanwhile, Charles and Margaret moved forward. Margaret continued as they always had. Steadfast, thoughtful, and unaffected. They refrained from making any public comments about Bradley. There was no need, the world had already spoken. Charles focused on his work, poring over policies and engaging with board members, ensuring that the lessons from Flight 207 would not just be a fleeting moment but a lasting change within First Air. For him, this was not about retribution. It was about advancement. Margaret, on her part, chose a quieter route. One afternoon, while Charles was in a meeting, she carefully penned a letter. Not a corporate statement, not a press release, a personal letter. She folded it neatly, placed it in an envelope, and sent it off. The ultimate lesson. 2 days later, Bradley Cooper stood by his apartment mailbox, hands cold as he sifted through the stack of envelopes. He hadn't anticipated discovering anything significant, certainly not from them. But then, it caught his eye. His name, elegantly, scrawled in cursive. No return address, just a single envelope. His hand shook as he pulled it open, revealing a solitary sheet of paper. A letter. He unfolded it slowly, his heart racing. Then he began to read. Mr. Cooper, I hope this letter finds you reflecting. You made a mistake, a serious one that cost you your job, your reputation, and perhaps even your sense of self. But here's the truth. This moment doesn't have to define your future. You have a choice. You can allow this mistake to be your end. Or you can. Let it be the start of something new, something better. I don't expect you to change overnight. No one can do that. But change is possible if you desire it. The question is, do you? Time will reveal the answer. Margaret Robinson's breath hitched as he finished reading. He read it again, and again. For the first time since that flight, since losing everything, he felt something unfamiliar. Something he hadn't experienced in ages. Hope. For the first time, he wondered if he could be better. Could he truly change? He had always thought he was above certain people. Now he realized he had never been above anyone. Perhaps this was his opportunity to finally grasp that. In another part of the city, Margaret sat with a cup of tea, gazing out at the sunset. Charles entered the room, casting a glance her way. You sent the letter? He asked. Margaret nodded. I did. Charles didn't pry into its contents. He understood his wife. He knew her heart. Instead, he settled beside her, their hands intertwining. Do you think he'll listen? He inquired. Margaret smiled softly, watching the horizon. I believe he must. Because once you truly see the truth, you can never unsee it. Some lessons stay with you forever.